Telestai here, April 19th, 2021. Proof series number 4. This is chapter 12 in that Forbidden Secrets book. And we're going to be going with prophecies today. And let's just dive right in. Were you aware that the story of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was first written not by Edward Gibbon in the 18th century of our era, but by the Bible prophet Daniel in 6th century BC? And Gibbon the skeptic used 6 large volumes in telling us in detail how accurate were the predictions of Daniel the prophet. Date of the prophecy. It is claimed the book of Daniel speaks of the Roman Empire, which did not arise until 168 BC. Such future knowledge is impossible, so the book must have been written after Rome arose, not by Daniel at all, but by some unknown author after 168 BC. In reality, yes, the book of Daniel does describe the Roman Empire, but the evidence is conclusive that Daniel was indeed written as early as the 6th century BC. It is not written in the scope of this present work to lay out the evidence for this, but you will find this evidence in my book, Stolen Identity, Chapter 21, which I've included the link to and you can download for free. Sufficient to state here that the skeptics' charge that Daniel was written after 168 BC is falsified by the fact that the book of Daniel was included in the Septuagint, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the date of which, 283 to 180 BC, is not disputed. The heavy artillery of the critics has been directed against the book of Daniel simply because the accuracy of Daniel's descriptions cannot be denied. It is a fact that Daniel's chapter 2 and 7 contain such clear predictions of world history, beginning with Babylon, reaching to the present moment, that the most skeptical have been hard-placed to account for them, unless they admit supernatural knowledge on the part of the prophet. And understandably, critics have tried hard not to face such an admission. They seem to think that if they can only show that Daniel never wrote a word of the book, but that it was composed much later, its prophecies will be invalidated. However, for our purpose, we shall accept the skeptic's date and will care not who wrote it. To go into the amazing details of Daniel's prophecies could take a complete book on its own, but we shall examine just a few. All who have read Daniel, skeptics or not, admit that the book teaches this, that beginning with Babylon, there shall be 4 great world powers in succession, 4 and no more, and then the sequence will be broken. Daniel chapter 7, verses 23 through 27, chapter 2, verses 39 through 45. The writer of Daniel claims he was informed by his divine messenger that the empire of Babylon, ruling in his day, would be overthrown. Other details of this coming event were pre-recorded by the Bible prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. Something like 60 prophecies were made concerning Babylon. We shall look briefly at 5. 1. Babylon's river will be dried up. I will dry up thy rivers, I will dry up her sea. Isaiah chapter 44:27, Jeremiah 51:11 and 36. The city of Babylon was extremely well fortified. From their lofty walls the inhabitants mocked the invading Medes and Persians. Not only was the city impregnable, but it contained enough provisions to last for 20 years. There was no entrance into Babylon except where the river Euphrates entered and emerged as it passed under the walls. Aware that he could not take the city by force, the Persian king Cyrus decided on a clever plan. He would turn away the water from its channel through the city, so at a given time he diverted the river upstream into a lake. The river below soon became shallow enough to ford, and his soldiers followed the riverbed under the gate into the heart of the city of Babylon. Written by Herodotus on page 190 and 191, Xenophon's Cyclopedia, version 5.1 through 36. The prophecy was amazingly fulfilled. 2. The gates will be left open. Thus saith the Lord to Cyrus, I will open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Isaiah chapter 45, verses 1 and 2. On each side of the river, through the city, were interior walls of great height. In these walls were enormous gates of brass, which, when closed and guarded, debarred all entrance from the riverbed to any of the streets that crossed the river. Had the gates been closed at this time, the invaders might have marched in vain along the riverbed between the walls and out again. But, feeling secure, the Babylonians had that very night put on a great feast. In their abandoned carelessness, these internal river gates were left open so the citizens could cross the river at will. Another fulfillment of prophecy. 3. The city will be captured during a festival. I will make drunk her princes, and her wise men, and her captains, and her rulers, and her mighty men, and they shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, saith the King, whose name is the Lord of heavenly armies. Jeremiah chapter 51, verses 39 and 57. Even the attempt to capture Babylon by means of the riverbed would have been in vain had not the whole city itself, over on that fateful night, given over to drunken revelry. Prophecy fulfilled. Number 4. It will be taken without a fight. The mighty men of Babylon have forborne to fight. They have remained in their holds. Their might hath failed. They became as women. One post shall run to meet another, and one messenger to meet another, to show the king of Babylon that the city is taken at one end. Jeremiah 51:30. No one noticed the sudden subsidence of the river. No one saw the entrance of the Persian soldiers. No one took care to close and guard the river gates. No one cared for anything that night except to plunge into the wild celebrations. That night cost the Babylonians their kingdom and their freedom. They went into it subjects of mighty Babylon, but they awoke from it slaves to the king of Persia. Every detail of those 4 prophecies was fulfilled precisely. 5. The Arabs will not pitch their tents in Babylon. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there. Isaiah 13:19. Some years ago, a Dr. Cyrus Hamlin was in Istanbul, then known as Constantinople, visiting with a colonel of the Turkish army. Dr. Hamlin asked the colonel if he had ever been to Babylon. Yes, replied the colonel, the ruins of Babylon abound in game. I engaged a sheik and his group and went to those ruins for a week's shooting. He described to his guests some of the thrills of his recent lion hunting expedition to the ruins. And I will tell you a curious incident, he said. Each morning and evening I had to do a long walk over the desert, all because of my Arab guide's refusal to camp overnight in the ruins. At sundown, the Arabs, to my amazement, began to strike their tents, getting ready to leave. I went to the sheik and protested, but nothing I could say had any effect. It is not safe, said the sheik, nor mortal flesh dare stay here after sunset. Ghosts and ghouls come out of the holes and caverns after dark, and whomsoever they capture becomes one of them. No Arab ever has seen the sun go down on Babylon. Dr. Hamlin showed interest and excitement. Taking out his copy of the Bible, he read from it, and Babylon, The glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there. The book of Isaiah, chapter 13, verse 19. That is history you're reading, said the colonel. No, answered Dr. Hamlin, it is prophecy. Those words were written when Babylon was in all her glory. The colonel was silent, and they never met again. Now I ask you, how did the Bible prophet know the Arabian would continue to exist after Babylon had become dust? Although a few humble Arabs lived in tents about Babylon 2,500 years ago, the Babylonians were the haughty rulers of many nations. Yet the utter extinction of that ruling race was foretold. Have you ever met a solitary living Babylonian? In effect, the prophet said this: while the most powerful race on earth will become extinct, together with their world-ruling city, this small, insignificant nomadic race of Arabs will continue on and on for thousands of years, long after this proud city has crumbled to ruins and its very site is almost forgotten. For that matter, how did Isaiah know the Arabs would continue to live near Babylon? Yet the prophecy clearly implies this. Since they were a wandering race, it would be logical to suppose that in any time they would either leave the vicinity of such a desolate place as it is now, or would themselves become extinct. But how did Isaiah know they would remain about Babylon's ruins, that they would be there today? Imagine the jeering sarcasm of skeptics if there were not an Arab within 1,000 miles of Babylon. And what a field day skeptics would have if all Arabs had become extinct as the dodo before Babylon sank into oblivion. Oh, and something else. How did Isaiah know that the Arabs would continue to live in tents? And how did he know that the Arabs would not make use of the ruins of Babylon for shelter? Many other explorers and excavators have reported the same fact, that it is impossible to get Arabs to remain on the site of this ancient city overnight. One explorer, Captain Mignon, says that he was accompanied by 6 Arabs completely armed, but he could not induce them to remain toward night, from apprehension of evil spirits. It is impossible to eradicate this area from the minds of these people. Written by Mignon in his book Travels, page 235. And all this despite the fact that Arabs are fearless fighters, dangerous warriors. Again, when Saddam Hussein was attempting to rebuild Babylon using bricks with his name inscribed on them, his workmen would not stay the night in that place. It is a fact that this prophecy about Arabs is amazingly unique in every particular, and each passing day serves only to strengthen its force. Medo-Persia. The prophecy of Daniel stated that Babylon would be overthrown by a kingdom inferior to it. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verses 38 through 39, the Medo-Persians who took Great Babylon in 538 BC were indeed a less powerful force. The Bible prophet Isaiah actually stated the name of the coming conqueror of Babylon. He would be a man named Cyrus. And yes, the name was included. And you can see it today in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 1. More amazing still, this prophecy concerning Cyrus was made in the late 700s BC, long before Cyrus was even born. The dating of Isaiah in history is well established. Cyrus did not conquer Babylon until 539 BC, which was more than 150 years after the prophet Isaiah mentioned him by name. Grecia. Daniel's prophecy stated that the next great empire, the one that would overthrow the Medo-Persian Empire, would be Greece, then relatively weak. Book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 3 through 7, 20 through 21. This was accurately fulfilled by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. Both Medo-Persia and Grecia were identified by name, and in this struggle, the winner and the loser were respectively named. The prophecy also stated that Greece's conquest would be rapid. Here is what eventually happened. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great swept through Tyre and Gaza region in his march towards Egypt. During his campaign, he turned toward Jerusalem. Alexander had already demanded men and supplies from the Jews who were under the rule of Alexander's enemy, the Persian king Darius. The high priest hesitated, saying that while Darius lived, they would remain loyal to him. Alexander was angry and began to move upon Jerusalem. Well aware of the danger, the high priest Hoshea and the other priests went out of the city to a carefully chosen place to meet the king. Alexander approached the high priest and members of the procession and greeted them. The priest invited Alexander into Jerusalem and the temple where, as the noted first-century historian Josephus records, he was shown Daniel's prophecy, written several centuries earlier, which foretold the rise and conquest of Alexander. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and, as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. Written by Flavius Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 8, Section 5. Many scholars regard Josephus as a reputable historian on the same footing as other ancient authorities such as Tacitus. I ask you, how did Daniel know 200 years earlier that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians? Daniel chapter 8, verse 4 through 7 and 20 through 21. Who imparted these impressions? Daniel was also told to write that this first king of the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great, would have a sudden end, dying while in his prime. Book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 8 and 21. And Alexander did die suddenly at the age of 33. Daniel also wrote that after Alexander's death, the Grecian Empire would break up into 4 divisions. The book of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 22. And it did. I ask you, how did Daniel know all these details? World power number 4, Rome. The prophecy continued, stating that a 4th empire would replace the Grecian. Its numerous characteristics were as described. The Roman Empire fulfilled the role exactly as predicted. Daniel chapter 7. If Daniel lived in 600 BC, then he foretold the rise and fall of these 3 empires beyond his day who were to follow Babylon. That's a marvelous series of predictions. In order to deny that these are prophecies written before the events, skeptical writers have contended that the book of Daniel must have been written in 168 BC after Rome had acquired rulership. Let's grant the skeptic his date for Daniel as 168 BC, if written 168 BC. But does this help his case? Sorry, if Daniel was written in Roman times, 168 BC, so that it comes after the events predicted, then the skeptic faces problem number 1. It means that the writer of Daniel had knowledge of the fact that in just 4 centuries, 538 BC to 168 BC, 4 empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, had ruled in succession. But now we see him predicting that contrary to the analogy of all previous history, there will not be a fifth world power to succeed the fourth. Here are the details of Daniel's prophecy. A. The fourth empire, Rome, will not be conquered by a fifth power, but will B. fall apart into a motley group of nations, some strong and some weak. Daniel chapter 7:24, chapter 2:41 through 42. And C. There will be attempts to weld it together again. And D. But the territory of the old Roman Empire will remain divided until the end of time. What daring to suggest that right at this point after the Fourth Empire, the past pattern of history would end. This is what no philosopher using past history to judge the future would ever dream of doing. It would be natural to guess that the coming centuries would repeat the pattern of the past centuries, because then, as now, it was believed that history repeats itself. Since the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian by the Grecian, and the Grecian by the Roman, would it not be natural to expect the Roman Empire to be conquered by some other world power? No, said Daniel. Precisely after the Fourth Empire, the pattern will change. The Fourth World Empire will not be conquered by a fifth. The kingdom shall be divided. Book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 41. I ask you, did the writer of Daniel have some other source of information not accessible to anyone else? If written circa 600 BC, this is the other option for the date the prophecy was written. If Daniel was written about 600 BC, one must concede that the descriptions of events are too amazing to be explained away easily. A skeptic is faced with problem number 2. Accurate foreknowledge. The critic loses either way. So whether the book of Daniel was written about 600 BC or 168 BC, the problem of prediction remains unsolved. But this is not all. We have already noted that there would be only 4 world powers in direct succession, one conquering the other, 4 and no more. And then the fourth power, the Roman Empire, would be split up into 10 nations, or groups of nations, and these would remain divided until the end of time. The book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 23 and 24, chapter 2, verses 42 through 44. And as every schoolboy knows, in a consecutive series of 4, Rome was the fourth great empire. You can read any history written by anyone, but in particular read one of the greatest unbelievers, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and you will see that this immortal work is unwitting commentary on Daniel's accuracy. Indeed, the fourth empire, the Roman, was not succeeded by another empire, but under the onslaught of a fierce northern tribes, Rome simply broke apart into a mass of smaller kingdoms. The historian Machiavelli names these 10 kingdoms as the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, Franks, Vandals, Suevi, Huns, Anglo-Saxons, Heruli, Lombards, and the Burgundians. 7 of these are represented by present-day nations. The prophet said these smaller nations would continue to exist, with 3 exceptions noted by the prophet himself. Daniel chapter 7, verses 8 and 24, to the end of time. Prophecies in Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 and 17 complement this prophecy of Daniel 2 and plainly reveal that the Roman Empire, although officially dead, would enjoy 7 temporary resurrections. These have been fulfilled in the several successive attempts to reunite Europe. The prophecy went further. It suggested that in order to weld the divided nations of the old Roman Empire together, alliances would be attempted, even by intermarriage. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 43, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Well known as Napoleon's arrangement of marriages between the various royal families of Europe, with the result that their seed is now virtually all intermingled a remarkable fulfillment of prophecy. But would bonds of unity among the nations by intermarriage prove successful? The prophecy says no. But they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with miry clay. When the call to war was sounded, cousin fought cousin. The bonds of international marriage, forged in the attempt to consolidate Europe, snapped apart in the face of war. A recurring theme of the past 1500 years has been the repeated attempts to unify Europe. Successive attempts to break the prophecy of Daniel were made by the mighty Charlemagne, the swift Charles VII of Sweden, and the ambitious Charles V, the proud Louis XIII, and the resistless, eagle-eyed Napoleon. However, these 7 fateful words in Daniel's prophecy stopped each of them. But they shall not cleave one to another. Now what if some conqueror had re-cemented all the nations of the old Roman territory into one successful mighty empire, subject to his sovereign will? What could one say? But can anyone produce any such failure of Daniel's prophecy? As Napoleon's conquering forces invaded Russia, they were suddenly devastated by the coldest winter in all Russian history. This was a turning point in Napoleon's campaign. Then at Waterloo in 1815, a mighty downpour of rain bogged down Napoleon's big guns and gave time for reinforcements to bolster Wellington's troops and save Britain from defeat. Believe it, the prophecy of Daniel was stronger than all the might of Napoleon. When in exile on the drab and drear island of St. Helena, Napoleon read the book of Daniel and for the first time understood why he had so miserably failed to weld the broken bits of the old Roman Empire into his cherished empire. The priceless lives of thousands, the wasted mints of money, the misery and tragedy that resulted might have been spared if Napoleon had consulted Daniel first. Just before World War I in 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was shown this same prophecy in the Bible. He responded, "It does not fit into my plans." Subsequently, the German army swept all before in the heart of Belgium and France and on toward the English Channel, prompting Kaiser William to declare, "I will have Christmas dinner in Buckingham Palace." The British people realized that the only divine help could save them, and the nation humbly knelt in prayer. In the sky appeared what are today known as the Angels of Mons. More than once they appeared, causing the Germans to halt and retreat in disorder, and their horses to panic. The Angels of Mons incident was observed by many British troops. Admittedly, the phenomenon has been debunked by some. However, as I write this, my colleague John Page, a man of proven integrity, has reported to me, my father Philip was there and confirmed the angel's appearance. Confirmation also came from Captain Haywood of the British Intelligence Service. On April 22, 1915, April launched her first gas attack. That's only 3 days from today, almost 106 years ago. Interesting. The wind direction was supposed to be settled for the next 36 hours, but it suddenly reversed and the gas was blown back to the German lines with disastrous results. The Bible speaks of God's dealing with the wind 116 times. The Kaiser missed his dinner in Buckingham Palace. In fact, he died in exile chopping wood. Those 7 prophetic words beat him. Next came Hitler's horde sweeping across Europe. The Nazi dictator boasted, "Where Napoleon failed, I will succeed." Hitler brought up a host of secretly built weapons to destroy Britain. These included the mighty Luftwaffe, the biggest air force in the world's largest battleships, powerful rockets, and the pilotless Doodlebug. The Nazi forces overran nation after nation. France, Holland, Belgium fell, and Britain was next for defeat. As the planet trembled at the march of the Nazis, scholars who knew Daniel's prophecy were opening it up and reassuring audiences around the world that Hitler will not win. In May 1940, Nazi panzer tank divisions in France were closing in on the British troops. All 350,000 of them, hemmed in on the bench at Dunkirk, were trapped. Suddenly, Hitler ordered the panzer divisions to halt and draw back. His generals were speechless. Now the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, was to take over. It looked as though the trapped Allied forces would be destroyed by the Luftwaffe. A day of national prayer was proclaimed for May 26, 1940, led by King George VI, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and members of the British cabinet in Westminster Abbey. Also, throughout the Commonwealth, millions committed the cause this dark hour to the Almighty One. Within 48 hours, a great storm broke over Flanders, giving cover to the British forces and hampering the enemy. General Halder, chief of the German General Staff, complained in his diary for May 30th, 1940. Bad weather has grounded the Luftwaffe, and now we must stand by and watch countless thousands of the enemy getting away to England right under our noses. At the same time, the English Channel, which is notoriously rough, became miraculously calm, enabling hundreds of small craft from Britain to come over to France and assist in evacuating the troops from Dunkirk. Why such a simultaneous miracle of opposites? A storm to ground the Luftwaffe and a calm channel for the rescue of doomed men? Because the scripture cannot be broken. The book of John, chapter 10, verse 35. It stated emphatically, "They shall not cleave one to another." Hitler now attacked England from the air. After 2 months of this, both the Luftwaffe and the RAF, England's Royal Air Force, were at the point of exhaustion. However, unbeknown to Hitler, the Luftwaffe, with their superior numbers, was close to overcoming the RAF. Then, suddenly, Hitler ordered them to stop attacking the RAF. After bombing England for a while, he turned and started to attack the Soviet Union. The fleeing Russians burned their crops so as to leave no food for the advancing Nazi forces. Then it started to rain. The whole invading army got bogged down in the mud. Then it turned cold. The tanks could not move again. Then it got unbelievably cold, minus 67 degrees below zero. Now the most devastating winter freeze since the year of Napoleon's invasion fell upon the German troops, and they were still in their summer uniform. Just 20 miles from Moscow, the German general sent out the word, "We can go no further. This is the end." Hitler was beaten by little things, drops of water. Why? Because the scripture cannot be broken. Back in England, the troops who had escaped from Dunkirk regrouped, were rearmed, and helped to overthrow Hitler and bring deliverance to Europe. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I personally addressed audiences on why Russia cannot win. Again, Daniel's 7 words. They shall not cleave one to another, stopped communism's nefarious ambitions cold. Here was prophecy in action. Actionable proof in real life. In the past, uniting Europe was temporary and always accomplished by force. Today, the nations of Europe are coming together voluntarily, forming an ever closer union as they integrate economically, politically, and militarily. But Daniel's prophecy says it will be like a mixture of iron and clay, making it partly strong and partly broken. Mull over that for just a moment. Is there a more apt description of Europe today? Politically and economically, Europe is a continent of iron and clay. some nations strong and robust, others weak and fragile. The European Union is a mixture of iron and clay, making it partly strong and partly broken. The prophecy says they will be integrated, but only for a brief moment. Based on this, you can count on the emergence of a short-lived and crumbly union, yet powerful, possessing the strength of iron. While Europe will unite, its bonds will be weak and short-lived, like clay and iron, which cannot mix. If you think on it for a while, this truly is mind-staggering. This prophecy was written more than 2,500 years ago, yet it describes today Europe perfectly. And of this you can be sure. Upon those same 7 faithful words that defeated previous attempts, the European Union will collapse also. The emerging New World Order will likewise be short-lived. Just wait and see. Bible prophecy has spoken. The prophecy then moves on to its final stage, forecasting a sudden end to human history. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. The one directing the Bible writers actually claimed to be the creator of heaven and earth, and he instructed them to write down this challenge to the unbeliever: either A, make similar prophecies of world history, or to B, break one of his. No man or woman on this planet has been able to do either. I submit to you that each fulfillment of prophecy on its own is a strong point in favor of divine wisdom, but each additional fulfillment increases the strength of the evidence, not by addition, but by multiplication. It seems evident that someone with intelligence is behind all this. History is his story. And in the case of Ken Laub and Millie, see chapter 8, he knows each of us personally and works through his influence in our daily activities. Here is a providence that we often don't recognize, but it is operating all the time. If you only knew impossible events which suggest intelligent intervention are occurring every day all over Earth, believe me, it is so. I have experienced them myself, and honestly, I would rather live my life as if there is such a God and die to find out there isn't, than live my life as if there isn't and to die to find out that there is. Of numerous other Bible prophecies, just look at these few. The time of the end will see fast travel and an increase in knowledge, Daniel 12:4. Wheeled vehicles shall rage in the streets, they shall jostle one another in broad ways, they shall seem like torches, they shall run like the lightnings, Nahum 2:4. A young peaceful power will arise in the new world, attain global dominance, then undergo a change of character to enact oppressive laws, Revelation chapter 13. A Middle Eastern group of nations will be against every man, and every man's hand against them, Genesis 16:12. See the fulfillment of this prophecy documented in The Weapon the Globalist Fear, chapter 22. A religious power in the city of the 7 hills will direct the emerging world order, Daniel 7:23-25, Revelation 17 in verses 3, 9, and 18, and chapter 13. The European power will establish a base in Jerusalem, Daniel 11:45. Finance, buying and selling will become globally controlled, Revelation 13:14-17. This end times will be characterized by a proliferation of wars, famines, plagues, earthquakes, raging seas, fearful sights in the sky. Luke chapter 21, verses 10, 11, and 25. Mankind will actually acquire the capability to destroy the entire earth. Revelation 11:18, bringing the danger that none might survive. Matthew chapter 24 verses 21 through 22. Fear will grip the nations with no apparent way out. Luke 21:25 through 26. The world will be plunged into a time of trouble such as never was. Daniel 12:1. Matthew 24 verses 21 and 22. Man will not be permitted to wipe out all life for the sake of those who live in harmony with him. The Creator will intervene. The earth's cities will fall. Man's dominion will end. Daniel 12:1, Matthew 24 verses 21 and 22. Out of the ashes of the old, the Creator will bring forth a new earth which shall last forever. A world in which eternal youth, loving concern, and security are the norm, where transformed individuals are able to live in harmony and love. Daniel 2:44, Isaiah 24:1 through 6, 19 through 22, chapter 26, 20 through 21, Jeremiah 4:23 through 28, Isaiah 11:4 through 9, 35, 1 through 5 through 7, chapter 10, 65, 17 through 25, 66, 23 through 23, Malachi chapter 4 verses 1 through 2. Bible prophecy has a 3,500-year track record of never being wrong. With cold, hard, incontrovertible proof, there is no easier way to know what's coming. A climax is approaching. Every remaining major Bible prophecy is presently taking shape before our eyes. A careful investigation will confirm beyond reasonable doubt that the Bible prophecies are interconnected. There is an amazing unity between them, evidence that we have here in one book, an integrated message system. More than that, its coverage of world history given in advance compels us to consider that the Bible has been supervised by one who knows the end from the beginning, outside our time domain. At the very least, it can be safely accepted as an authoritative source, an intelligence report par excellence. The Rabbi's Curse. In 1656, a dispute arose in Poland between some distinguished Jewish rabbis and some students of the Book of Daniel. The dispute concerned Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. "Look," said the students, "this prophecy proves Yeshua to be the Messiah. It tells exactly when the Messiah was to suffer." The rabbis were so hard pressed by this argument it was embarrassing, so they broke up the discussion. The rabbis then held a meeting. As a result, they pronounced a curse upon any Jew who should attempt to work out the chronology found in this prophecy. This was their curse. "May his bones and his memory rot, who shall attempt to number the 70 weeks. Does this curse sort of arouse your curiosity? It did mine. So I undertook a long, careful investigation and discovered that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, we are given the actual length of time from a confirmable specified event in world history to the predicted year for the Messiah to appear. In 586 BC, the Babylonian armies laid waste the land of Judah and dragged its people into captivity. Their capital city, Jerusalem, lay in ruins. About 70 years later, the Hebrew prophet Daniel, a captive in Babylon, was poring over a prophecy penned by an earlier prophet, Jeremiah, which stated that after 70 years of desolation, the captivity would come to an end. This can be found in Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, chapter 29, verse 10, and Daniel chapter 9, verse 2. Confessing the wrongs of his people which had brought such disaster upon them, he prayed to the fulfillment of this prophecy for Jerusalem's restoration would not be delayed. Daniel chapter 9, 3 through 19. Daniel records that, in response to his prayer, a heavenly messenger named Gabriel appeared to assure him that his people would return to Jerusalem and it would be rebuilt. Outlining a succession of events to occur in the future, Gabriel also pinpointed the time in Roman history when the Messiah would appear. In a later visit to Daniel, Daniel chapter 11, he was described the emperor who would be reigning when the Messiah would die a violent death. And to top it off, there were Old Testament prophecies that identified not just the year, but the precise month, day, and hour in history when the event would occur. To see more on that, you can pick up the book by the same author, Ark of the Covenant, pages 182 through 188. Here follows Daniel's mathematical prophecy. 70 weeks are determined for the coming of the Messiah, the promised one. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the decree to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troubled times. And after the 62-week period shall the Messiah be killed, not for himself, but for others. After that the people of a coming prince shall destroy Jerusalem and the temple, and at the end of the war its desolation shall come like a flood. For 1 week the Messiah shall confirm with many God's promise of rescue for man, and halfway through the week he shall bring the sacrificial system to an end, and because of its abuse he shall destroy its temple until the end of time, when the judgment, which is decided, shall be inflicted upon the desolating power. Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27. Here is an outline of a prophecy that was to be fulfilled during a period of 70 weeks, along with other events which are not confined to the 70 weeks but are related. This prophecy unveiled the future history of Israel and the precise time of Messiah's appearance. How good are you at math? Well, that doesn't matter. You'll probably find this quite easy and fun. For starters, how many days are there in a week? 7. How many days are in 70 weeks? Well, 7 times 70 equals 490. See, that's easy. According to this prophecy, how many things are going to happen during 70 weeks? For one thing, a whole city would be built. Now just do a little figuring here. Think about that and you will see that we are dealing with a period of time that has to be no longer than just 490 days. Numerous Jewish scholars were clear on the fact that this prophecy is speaking of weeks of years, in which every day of the prophetic week means a year. This is in harmony with the Bible's own explanation of prophetic time. The Hebrew for 70 weeks literally means 70 sevens. This is recognized by scholars to mean 70 sets of 7 years, a total of 490 years, each day representing a year. The year for a day principle appears in the Bible as divinely established identity and prophetic symbolism. I have appointed thee each day for a year. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 4, 4 through 6, and the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verse 34. On 70 weeks, 70 times 7 years, Jewish commentator J.J. Slotky states, the cryptic phraseology may have been suggested by this 7-year cycle of Leviticus 25. The expression weeks of years occurs in the Mishnah. One could compare the expression weeks of years with 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, 40 and 9 years in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 8. Other Jewish scholars concur. On he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, Daniel 9:27. Midrash Rabbah reads, week represents a period of 7 years. On the same reference, verse 27, the Talmud says 1 week in Daniel 9 means a week of years. On 70 weeks are determined, verse 24, the Talmud states it would be 490, or 70 weeks of years. Isaac Lesser refers to the ancient Jewish writers, Rashi and other commenters, as recognizing years as weeks. So then the prophecy indicates a period of 490 years, 70 times 7 years, allotted to the Jewish nation, during which certain events will occur. You'll notice the prophecy deals with A, the coming of the Messiah, as well as B, the history of Jerusalem. Here was a promise that Jerusalem was to be rebuilt and its status restored. There is a clear structure to this prophecy in which each verse deals first with the Messiah and then with Jerusalem. Separating those two, the Messiah, verse 25, at the end of 7 plus 62 weeks, Messiah will appear. Verse 25 for Jerusalem, it will be rebuilt but under conditions of distress. Verse 26, the Messiah, after the 7 plus 62 weeks, Messiah will die violently. Jerusalem, a desolator prince, will destroy it again. The Messiah, verse 27, during the 70th week, Messiah will keep covenant with many people. In the midst of the 70th week, Messiah will cause sacrifices to cease, and the desolator himself will be destroyed as predetermined for Jerusalem. Verse 24 says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. All these things were to be accomplished by the Messiah. A full explanation of these details appears in the same author's book, Ark of the Covenant. Very well, you ask, this 70-week period, which we now know to be 490 years, when was it to commence? If we can find the starting point, the rest of the prophecy should be easy to understand. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the word, which means decree or commandment, to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troubled times. The book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 25. It begins with the decree to restore and build Jerusalem. When did this take place? The Bible itself tells us. It was in the seventh year of the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes, and this can be found in the book of Ezra, chapter 7, verses 1, 7, and 8, when he issued his first decree, verses 11 through 26, to rebuild the ruined city of Jerusalem. Leading up to this decree were 2 others, those of Cyrus and Darius, which related only to the building of the ruined temple. In 536 BC, Cyrus allowed the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. You can find more on this in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, 22, and 23. In 520 BC, Darius reaffirmed and expedited Cyrus's decree concerning the temple, and in February 515 BC, the temple was dedicated. The book of Ezra, chapter 6, 13 through 18. Around 520 BC, a governor beyond the river by the name of Tattenai, whose name is recorded on a cuneiform tablet, investigated the Jewish temple rebuilding project, which had now been underway for 16 years. As a result, he wrote asking Darius to check the Persian archives to see whether indeed the Jews had been given permission from Cyrus to rebuild the temple. Darius responded with a thorough search and recovered a memo of Cyrus's decree. This is also found in the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. He then issued the requested information, verses 6 through 12, in a new decree confirming that of Cyrus. The specific mention made by Cyrus, Darius, and Tattenai was for the rebuilding of the temple. While individual dwellings were erected here and there around the ruined capital, no evidence exists that the city proper was rebuilt as a result of Cyrus and Darius's decrees. As late as 519 BC, Zechariah was still promised in a vision that plans would be laid for the reconstruction of the city. But the construction of Jerusalem itself was accomplished according to the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 14. Ezra, the biblical scribe, considered the third decree to be the culmination of the three. His use of the singular word decree to cover the three documents indicates the unity of the decrees. It also directs attention to the third one, without which the first two were incomplete. It was this third decree in the 7th year of Artaxerxes in 457 BC which gave Jerusalem its legal rebirth, restoring full autonomy in legal judgments, including the death penalty. The book of Ezra, chapter 7, verse 7 and 24 through 26. This made possible the restoration of Jerusalem to capital city status, necessitating its rebuilding as a visible administrative center. It was this third decree which the prophecy had in mind when it spoke of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, Daniel 9:25. It took the three decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and of Artaxerxes I to implement the commandment of God, as Ezra terms it, Ezra 6:14. But when 457 BC arrived, the commandment of God was complete. It is from this date, therefore, that Daniel's 490 years begins. You ask, can this date 457 BC be substantiated? Indeed, this date is now firmly established as 457 BC by four independent sources: Greek Olympiad dates, Ptolemy canon, Elephantine papyri, and Babylonian cuneiform tablets. For example, one of the Jewish Elephantine papyri, written between Tishri 465 BC and Nisan 464 BC, is dated Ascension year of Artaxerxes. All four lines of chronological evidence point unanimously and harmoniously to the fact that the 7th regional year of Artaxerxes I extended from Nisan month 1 in the spring of 458 BC to Adar, month 12, in the spring of 457 BC. From the extensive amount of evidence available, these dates can be considered as firmly and irrevocably fixed. As Ezra arrived in Palestine in the 5th month of the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign, Ezra 7:8, he implemented the decree. Since in Old Jerusalem the Jewish months were numbered from spring to spring, the 5th month fell between mid-July and mid-September on our calendar, depending on the timing of the Jewish New Year day given in a year. The 5th month of the 7th year of Artaxerxes fell in late summer or early autumn of 457 BC. The decree was implemented soon after. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troubled times, so says Daniel's prophecy. Ezra notes that both the street, Ezra 10:9, that is, the broad, empty space where the houses were formerly built, and the wall, enclosing the city, Ezra 9:9, were rebuilt. Nevertheless, the builders were hindered and their plans thwarted by the opposition of the Samaritans, who hired counselors to frustrate them. At the Persian capital in Shushan, or Susa, Nehemiah received a report that his fellow Jews were in great affliction and reproach, and that the newly built wall of Jerusalem had been broken down and the gates burned with fire. Nehemiah 1:1-4. Distressed, Nehemiah sought permission from Artaxerxes to visit Jerusalem and rebuild it. Nehemiah 2:5. That is, repair the damage. The Persian king issued letters, verse 7, giving him permission to go to Judah and receive lumber for gates, verse 8. In chapter 3 of his account, Nehemiah used the word repaired 33 times. Now it came to pass when our enemies heard that there was no breach left in the wall, that they thought to do me mischief. chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. Nevertheless, in spite of troubles, the wall was finished in 52 days. Verses 15 and 16, a 52-day repair job. This wall construction in 444 BC was not the predicted building of the new wall, but the repair of the damage by opponents. Indeed, as Daniel predicted, these turned out to be troubled times, just as it was prophesied. The prophecy of Daniel allows for the building of the city and the wall, a total period of 7 weeks, or 49 years. Here, then, are our first 7 weeks in Daniel's prophecy. 49 years equals 7 weeks. Since historical records from Palestine are so scant, we cannot find independent evidence that Jerusalem was precisely 49 years in the rebuilding. However, the wording of the prophecy that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, provides us with a specific time for the more important event, the appearance of Messiah, the Prince of God. 7 plus 62 equals 69 weeks of years. 69 times 7 years. 69 times 7 equals 483. If we calculate 483 years from the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, we should get the very year when Messiah would appear. Now I suggest you follow this closely and check it yourself. There is no date in Bible history of which one can be more certain. There is also no doubt that this prophecy existed. It was translated into Greek in a version called the Septuagint by 70 Jewish scholars in Alexandria between 283 and 180 BC and circulated throughout the entire Greek-speaking world. Daniel wrote the prophecy. Ezra recorded the commencement date. Then, for 400 years, there was silence, while Israel and some others waited. The countdown had begun.